Well, so firstly, thank you very much for having invited me for this conversation. I've just got a few slides which I thought might prompt a discussion around the idea of implanted technologies. My background is I'm head of the North at Candesic. Candesic is a management consultancy firm based in principally in London. I lead our practice outside of London in Manchester. It's about 35 of us, and we work across healthcare, life sciences, and of course medical technology as well, which is very much at the heart of what I want to talk about today. I'm also lecturer of medicine at the University of Oxford, where I focus on teaching anatomy, fortunately for operating on myself, but also teaching students about how to use software and technology in their own clinical practice. I also teach neuroscience at Stanford University, both at the Stanford program in the UK, so the students who take semesters out to come to the University of Oxford, but also in the United States as well, where my focus is on looking at rodent behaviours in response to endorphin stimuli. But today I'm going to be talking about implants, and I think as has been mentioned, this came about because I posted on LinkedIn the fact that I've got one particularly fun party trick, which is the ability to pay for things using just my hand, a chip implanted in it. And with the increase in the United Kingdom of the contactless payment limit to £100, this is an increasingly dangerous party trick to have. It does always, I must say, seem to be my round, the excuse being that everyone wants to see the chip and absolutely nothing to do with the fact they want free beer. So what I'd just like to do is take a little bit of a step back in talking about implanted technologies. We've come a very long way in terms of this technology, and very recently as well. What you can see here is actually not a subdermal implant. This is an eyeball replacement, and it's basically a little camera that a filmmaker had his own eye removed and instead had this device placed in, and so he can, with one of his eyes, with his right eye, he can film what's going on. And so we really are on the cusp of this kind of cyborg transformation, I think. I'm really excited about the union between silicon and carbon, basically, the way in which we will increasingly be compensating for deficits in our own bodies, but also augmenting our own functions with implants. And whilst this is a very sort of potentially disturbing eyeball replacement, you actually see on the top right-hand side there the sorts of chips that I've got implanted in my own body. They're about the size of 2 grains of rice for the most part, so very innocuous. And unless you saw me paying for something or opening a door or something with a wave of my hand, your conclusion would either be that I was magic or indeed that it was all smoke and mirrors. My interest really in implants started a very long time ago, the beginning of the 20th. An academic at the University of Oxford. I was just doing my PhD then at that time, and I was working in a lab group led by Professor John Stiles and Professor Tipu Aziz, and we were pioneering the use of deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's disease. I'm going to talk a bit more about deep brain stimulation throughout this talk, but basically it involves implanting electrodes into the brain, which are powered by a pacemaker-style battery that resides in your chest, just above your nipple. And these had really transformative effects on our patients' lives. So it combined my two passions of neuroscience and technology. And since that time, I've sort of continued to work in that field, but it's only been over the last 2 or 3 years that the technology has advanced such that I've been able to start experimenting on myself, really, and seeing what the limits of this sort of implanted technology are. The idea that we're going to do body modification effectively, and we're going to start to biohack our way into where we want to be, isn't particularly new. Obviously, these aren't subdermal implants you see on the left-hand side of the screen. What we're seeing is foot binding, elongation of the neck, sharpening of the teeth, and these are the sorts of practices which have been going on for many thousands of years. Whatever their motivation, whether it be aesthetic or control, or part of some very interesting, I'm sure, societal and anthropological dynamic, we definitely are not unfamiliar with the idea that for whatever reason we manipulate our own anatomy in order to achieve our goals. And you can see a much obviously more recent example of a young man who thought that in preparation for his job interview, it would be a good idea to get this done. So you can see he's got here clearly a combination of subdermal and transdermal implants. So probably useful for me just to define A subdermal implant is an implant which goes under the skin and is completely encapsulated by the skin as when it heals. So those are the examples of the rather charming horns this man has decided his forehead was better adorned with. And then he's also got an example in his nose of a transdermal implant, and that's an implant which goes underneath the skin. So in this case, it goes through his septum in his nose, but it emerges into the outside world as well. And we're going to talk about a couple of examples of subdermal and then also these transdermal implants as well. A transdermal implant will always carry a bigger risk with it because obviously you've created a hole between the outside world and the inside world where no hole really should exist, and therefore it's an opportunity for infection to track in. But we'll see as we go along and hopefully have a conversation about some of the potential risks and pitfalls associated with messing about. Just so you know what it actually looks like in neurosurgery, I myself, because I have no bedside manner and didn't really want to chit-chat all day to patients with back pain, but unfortunately it seems the only thing I was really good at was neurosurgery, and my patients were awake throughout the operation, so that was a bit of a failure on my part. So you'll see here what we've got is a big sensing coil that's going to detect where the electrodes we're popping into the brain is, and a lot of Meccano around somebody's head here. It's called a stereotaxic net. That means that we're keeping these patients absolutely still, even though we want them to be awake, just in case we slip up and accidentally destroy something important, which we aim not to do most of the time. But we're going to talk a bit about gain of function implants, and we were talking earlier about the difference between a subdermal and a transdermal implant. Actually, Wolverine has both. Wolverine's spikes are subdermal until he gets angry or whatever, and then they poke out of his skin as the character believes. The character says a great deal of pain. But we're not talking about the sorts of implants which are now sort of routinely available. We're talking about these very small things that I described. You can see an X-ray image there with the radio opaque, the white little dot there in the hand, which is just between the thumb and the first finger, actually in the anatomical snuff box, as we call it. Very tiny things, and you'll see an example. These 3 chips here, I have all of these chips in my hands, along with some others. And these are pretty straightforward RFID chips. That basically means that they are passive, they don't have a battery in them. But when you put energy, you pulse energy into the vicinity of them, they take that energy up and they're able to give data back effectively to a receiver. And not huge amounts of data, but certainly sufficient, for example, to run a small program, to contain a little bit of text data, or to send you somewhere else within the digital universe. And that's really the most exciting thing that you can do is send chips, because that unique address gives you an ability to send somebody anywhere within the digital universe, and it could be somewhere with a huge amount of rich content, and the scanning of this chip could unlock access to that. And you can just see at the top here the size. This is the larger one actually that's shown here, which is 14 millimeters long. And the way that it's actually implanted in this instance, as you can see, that you've got an injector assembly here, which is just a very big, large bore needle that you stick into the skin. You pull your skin up into a little tent, and you pop the needle in, push it in about 4 or 5 centimeters, and you push the plunger down, and it deposits the needle. When you remove the large bore needle, you've just got a very small incision, 2-3 millimeters across, and that doesn't really need a stitch. Pop a stitch in if you're overcautious, but actually if you just stop the bleeding, get a nice tight bandage on it, you're good. Swelling will be down in a couple of days, and you're almost immediately ready to be writing to your chip and reading from your chip as well. What sort of things can you do? Why would I do this to myself? Well, I'm certainly not, I'm certainly not interested in the pain of doing it, but definitely the functions excite me and the sorts of things that you can do with the chip. So I've got a Tesla, and you can open my car with my chips. It always used to be, when I first got these chips, used to be able to program them to open your car, but not to turn it on. So I'm not quite sure how useful that was, unless you sort of lost your keys or your phone and your card and whatever else you used to get into a Tesla, and you wanted shelter from the snow, but you couldn't actually go anywhere. But now, actually, with a very active community of biohackers involved in cracking all these problems, you can indeed turn the car on as well. And so whatever happens, you know, this, but to get into the car, but now you can actually just use your hand to get in and go. Unfortunately, it's made swinging really difficult for me. There's nothing for me to do with the bowl in the hall. I just have to wave my hand over it. But apart from that, it's without problem. You can also use this just like you would an access card as well into your office building. So I get into my office with my hand, and I actually happen to work in my office in central London. Is above the New Zealand High Commission, so they're all very keen on security. So I still have to pretend to scan my card because I'm not altogether sure that the diplomatic protection of the New Zealand ambassador would be very impressed that I'd hacked their security and implanted it into my own hand. But anyway, don't tell them. We'll edit this bit out. And then, well, why else might it actually be useful? So the thing is, we get lots of patients into hospital who are found without any ID on them. Delirious, wandering naked through the street. They could have been robbed. All sorts of things that mean that we get people through who, for whatever reason, unconsciousness or lack of ability, cannot communicate to you important things about themselves. They can't tell you their name. They can't tell you their medical histories. So we start treating them empirically. So we assume that probably don't have any allergies, but you know, they might, and we might be using things on them which are going to cause a very significant and serious reaction. And so one of the things that Microchips do is it directs you to a website I built which has my medical history in it. Now, it turns out my medical history isn't particularly exciting. I'm not actually allergic to anything, and there's nothing really anybody needs to know. But you can imagine, for example, if we find a patient and we direct it to their history in this way, that we might find out, yeah, I'm allergic to penicillin. In my history, there might be the fact that I've had my appendix taken out. Okay, why is that important? Well, I find if I'm looking at a patient and thinking, oh, they might have had appendicitis, and this is the 2 years ago they had their appendix out, I'm wrong, obviously, and I need to be thinking about something else. And so this is really about empowering people, I think, to, in the worst case scenario, still be able to pass on vital information to healthcare professionals. Now, at the minute, the fact that you can access my medical history from your phone on my hand isn't very useful because we are not routinely looking for where anyone's got microchips in. But in the future, that might well change. And there's a London startup called Imply, which is trying to do pretty much what I've done, but do it at a much bigger scale. And those guys, one of the first things they've developed is a cool app and platform. And they want as many people as possible to have their medical records accessible through that very personal key that you really can't leave behind as you've got your hand chopped off. And I think, you know, over the next few years, I'm very comfortable that we will be using that for this very purpose. I think for some other forms of identification, obviously we can, you know, use facial scanning, and a lot of the patients, you know, if they've been in a serious accident, you can't use any of those biometric identifiers. They're, you know, if they've been punched a lot in the face or, you know, hit their windscreen with their head or whatever, none of that actually works. So the chip is a really sort of nice, safe way of safeguarding people in that instance. I have thought about actually having a big arrow tattooed on my hand saying, if found, scan me here. But I might end up like that unfortunate young man whose job interview didn't go as well as he thought at the beginning of it. So in addition to having these RFID chips, which are pretty cool and can enable me to communicate information, open doors and cars and all that sort of cool stuff, actually open my cat flap as well. So one thing I actually share in common with my cats is the ability to get through that. But I have another chip, and here it is in action. And so I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this, and I'd shout out if it doesn't work. So that very obliging young man at the coffee shop opposite my house had already seen that a few times, but I like to go and terrorise other shop owners in the northwest of England. So Okay, it is cool. Everybody, or almost everybody, thinks it's interesting and exciting. 1% of people believe I'm the devil incarnate. I'm genuinely, would this evil that I'm doing in the world by buying water with a chip implanted under my skin. But I mean, is it useful really? Well, I can pay with my watch. I actually also have a payment ring as well. Just like a jewelry ring that's got a chip in that pays. I can pay with my cards, all sorts of things. Could even have cash. I mean, if this were a little bit further north than Congleton, maybe they forced me to use it. But why might this actually be useful and fun, more than fun? Well, yeah, it is in that case where you've kind of lost your wallet or all those other means of payments. If I was mugged, someone probably would take my watch along with my wallet, and instead of having to find another phone to get a code to get emergency cash out, I know that there's a bit of a safety net here, which is that I've always got cash on me. Then it's basically just a MasterCard payment process. Anyway, you can pay with a MasterCard, you can pay with this chip. So chips from a company called Walletmore, and basically it's the first chip of its kind that's got a payment mechanism in it. It's the only chip actually. And you can see how big it is. So it's a bit bigger than those other chips I showed you in terms of its cross-sectional area. And the reason for that is because you need bigger space over which to coil the antenna in order to create a strong enough signal for reliable communication of data. It's not actually so important with the other RFID chips, but in the case of a payment transaction, the device that reads your contactless card, or in my case, my hand, has to have a very strong signal between the chip and the reader. And that's so that we can be absolutely sure that in a financial transaction, we are generating a signal which is has high fidelity. We're sure it's the right account that we're taking money from. But it's very thin, so it kind of compensates for it in that way. Now, pop this chip where I showed you previously between the thumb and the first finger. But I'm running out of space on my hands. And so just like in your wallet, when you've got lots of cards and you're trying to pay for the tube or something, you've got a problem of card clash, right? Multiple chips trying to access the same reader. Well, I've now got that problem in my hands. I've got chip clash. And so I'm constantly trying to find different parts of my body that are 4 or more centimeters away from my other chips. Otherwise, nothing's going to work. And it's a bit more complicated than reshuffling the cards in your wallet if you want to start moving these chips around. So sorry if anybody's a bit squeamish, but believe me, you'd rather see this picture than do it yourself. So you can see in the top right-hand side, this is the kind of kit that you get through the post. What you hear, unlike that injector assembly that we saw previously, you've got a very large bore needle separator. This needle, basically, you just use it, as you can see in the photograph, put it underneath the skin to create what's called a dermal pouch, which is just a bit of space between the skin on the outside and the fascia, the connective tissue just above the muscle underneath it. And once you've created that little pocket, you can pop this chip in. So you see that's a much bigger needle than for the others, but it's a bigger chip. Now, how do you do this? How do you get the chip inside you? Well, it turns out this is actually one of the biggest challenges, because if you go and ask, well, what would you do? I went and asked a lot of people who did body modification piercing. So I went to the Northern Quarter in Manchester, which is where the cool kids hang out and get the spikes in the head and all of that. And so I said, oh, will you just pop this in for me? Because I actually wanted it in my right hand, and I'm not actually that good at sewing with my left hand, it turns out. So I thought I'd get somebody else to do it. But they were shocked. They were like, no, of course we can't do this. We're not sure about if it's ethical or anything like that. I'm like, you've got a spike in his penis. You're worried about my tiny little scratch on my hand. Anyway, they were. They're insured for some things, but apparently not everything. So I wasn't deterred anyway. So I'm by no means advocating this, but I just sellotaped my hand to a plank of 2x2 and had a beer and got on with it myself. And yeah, it's a bit painful, but wasn't the end of the world really. And yeah, it's been in my hand for quite a while now. I hope, if any of you, please don't tell my surgical colleagues that this is how I did it, because you will note that my aseptic technique leaves a great deal to be desired in this instance. But I blame the beer, the Dutch courage, for that. That's what I'm doing basically. And that's where I am right now. So I can do things like open doors, and I can pay for things. Already I feel, you know, that I'm ahead of the curve, hopefully. But there's so much more that we can do with implants. Sometimes I think. So here are two examples which I really like. And so Heinz Klesler is an artist, and he's one of a group of artists who've implanted transducers into their occipital bones of their skull. So that's the back of that big bone at the back of your head, and he's got this sensor here that he's wearing, looking very futuristic with his matching hairdo and shell suit, and that sensor actually looks at the visual scene, and it detects color, the color palette of the scene you're in. So on average, is this a blue or a red or a yellow screen? And then that goes back to this transducer that's implanted in the bone of his skull, and that creates a vibration which corresponds to the color. And so effectively, and just like knocking on your own head, when you get vibration in the skull, you hear it. And so he effectively, therefore, is hearing color. It's a form of artificial synesthesia, a confusion of senses. He seems to like it, and so that's what he's basically up to. And this other chap over here, who seems to not be very happy with his invention, he's invented what's called North Sense, and you'll see just on his sternum, where his open collar is, there's a square patch there. This is an example of a transdermal implant. So in the sternum, he's got another vibrating element, and then outside what you're seeing is a large magnet. Hence it's called North Sense. So when this chap is facing north, it vibrates, and it vibrates in proportion to how close to facing north he is. So he's actually got a new sense there. He's not hijacking another sense, really. So now this guy can sense magnetic north, which actually sounds quite useful, because when you get those incredibly annoying sort of American people telling you to head north, you're like, well, where the bloody hell is north? I'm in the middle of New York. Well, this chap knows him. If he's going to the same place, obviously, otherwise it's a fool's errand. So we actually are seeing some of these new sort of realities, new sort of sensations, really, that we're able to generate. And I'm not saying I'm going to get one of these magnets, but pretty dangerous actually. But and you can't get through airport security. But it's cool. I'd be interested to know what it felt like to have another sense that I wasn't born with. Really interesting. Now, if you do smoke enough weed, you will be excited to put an electrode into your brain when you are perfectly healthy and have nothing particularly else to do with your billions of pounds. And so that's why Elon Musk invented Neuralink. Now, Neuralink basically is not there to compensate for any particular deficiency. The idea is that you be able to read and write to the brain. Reading's pretty easy. Reading from the brain's fairly easy, right? You can do it from outside of the skull, not very effectively, but not very well. With a great deal of geometric precision. So we can't read from individual neurons or small groups of neurons. All we can detect are waves of electrical activity that pass through the brain, and that's the basis of an electroencephalogram and EEG. But if you really want to get to the nuts and bolts of what's going on in neural circuitry, we need an electrode in there really to record. Now, what you can see here at the bottom, this is a pig. It's Elon's favorite pig, apparently, in the whole world, because the demonstration of the efficacy of the chip that his team have invented. And so you can see that on this pig's leg, what we've got here are some dots of different colors, and those correspond to these lines here. And the pig is on a treadmill, so it's walking forward. So if we take here on the right fore knee here, we've got a red dot, and so we've got a red trace here. And the dark red line is the actual. That means what the leg is actually doing, what that knee is doing through the cycle. So, it's a treadmill, you're walking, so forward, stop, blah, blah, blah. And then this lighter red line here, which is superimposed over the dark red line, is what is being recorded by the chip. So you can see that there's an incredibly high degree of correspondence here. You might not be that surprised. You might say, well, the brain's controlling the leg. So obviously, if you record, you're bound to see the electrical activity in the brain correlated with what's going on in the leg. One's controlling the other, therefore they should be correlated. But the thing is, this Neuralink is not popped into exactly the place that represents the control of the right fore knee. It's popped in pretty much randomly. So why should it correlate, therefore? Well, this is the teaching function, i.e. the writing function of this chip. So whilst this pig has been undertaking this task for several weeks, what's actually been happening is that the chip implanted into its brain has been goes forward, a little signal's gone out, and every time it stops, the signal turns off. And the brain is an incredibly plastic, adaptable, beautiful thing that means that neurons that fire at the same time as other activity takes place tend to wire together. So it's a principle called Hebbian plasticity. A brilliant neuroscientist, he said, neurons that fire together wire together. So somewhere in the brain, there will be a neuron that's controlling that right fore knee, and you'll be far off, another part of the cortex. But so the neuron that is controlling that knee will be firing when that knee is going forward. And your system, your chip, is going to cause the neurons below it to fire as well. So now you've got these two parts of the brain firing synchronously. And between these two synchronously firing areas of neurons, you'll have lots and lots of potential connections which might not be very strong, but exist. But going by that rule, neurons that fire together, wire together, eventually you don't need the training signal anymore. What you can do is read. Now, this isn't all about how to control pigs or monitor from pigs, but what it really allows you to do is to start to be able to very accurately control other things. So one day we might be able to control heavy machinery, right? Just using the power of our own brains and our thoughts. Or we might be able to control robotic surgery using it as well. And the idea is that actually, if we avoid the clumsy mechanics that are the normal way that our brains interface with the outside world, but instead go direct to the rich and sophisticated data representations of the brain, that we will be able to leapfrog human evolution and take over Elon's going to take over the world if he hasn't already. And you see actually on the right-hand side here, he doesn't even want mere mortals like me to get my hands dirty in anybody's brain anymore. He wants all these chips to be implanted by this robot he's invented. So he's doing me out of a job, but I'd keep smoking. Anyway, Finn, that's the end. And I hope it's a bit of food for thought, and I'm really happy to have a further chat about it.
I've got a quick question before I hand over to you. So I am a many pierced person. I've got plenty of, I've had microdermal piercings and things, but one of the biggest issues I had with those is that they tend to get rejected because they're foreign bodies. So how do you stop these microchips from getting rejected?
So the microchips are coated in a medical grade polymer. Now, ordinarily, when you pop something inside the body, it is treated as foreign. And what your body actually does is it creates lots of scar tissue around it called adhesions. And sometimes these can push out whatever you're trying to put in. But even if they don't push it out, they encapsulate it in a way which is really annoying and might stop a joint from moving or something like that. So the specific polymer which adhesions can't form to it. It's kind of too slippery for the collagen to connect to. And so I've not had any problems doing it myself. Certainly don't have any adhesions. So underneath my skin, the chips move around. So they're definitely not like tied down. Now, there's always a risk when you pop anything in that you're going to alongside it introduce infection. And of course, then you're closing the wound, so you're trapping the infection inside. And that is a bit of a risk. But if you use good surgical technique, which I did not, but I was just lucky, but basically just make sure you've got a nice, clean, sterile surface. You can really minimize that. And then obviously, if you're a particularly sort of worried soul, you can have some antibiotics at the same time. So it isn't without risk. Just like any time you're cutting into somebody, you're always going to have that infection risk. But ultimately, if this thing got rejected, I'll just take it out. I'll take any of them out, give it a good clean, and hopefully that'll be fine. So we're not talking about anything which is too dramatic and irreversible. I'm very unlikely to give myself sort of necrotizing fasciitis. Famous last words until I'm in hospital where they're going, "How did you do this, Dr. Taylor?" It's like, well, it's a long story, but I'm glad Janine recorded it.
No, I was just thinking, so the thing about having implants in your brain that can tell machinery what to do, it's just kind of, well, how do you mitigate from the machinery doing the things that you might tell the machinery to do that you really shouldn't be telling it to do? So yeah, I don't know how you get around that.
I mean, yeah, okay. So I kind of get your point in that. Are you worried that subconsciously you really would like to slice your colleague's head off, and that
Something like that.
The machine's going to go, actually, it's like, no, wouldn't really want to do it, but actually kind of do. So here you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, look. But if it's a conscious thought, it's just the same safeguards as everything else, right? Which is because actually, people get up to all sorts of mischief with things they're not supposed to be doing, right? Consciously. So it doesn't really matter if it's you using a joystick or you reading from your brain in that sense, or things that you have some people are really afraid of heights, not because they think they might fall, but because they think they might jump. And it's kind of like almost that kind of the fear of what you might be capable of. But yeah, I think that's you raise. How do we differentiate between our kind of things we really intended to do and things that we didn't, that we never would actually act on? But I guess we'll go back to what Darwin said, which was that free will is an illusion created by our inability to determine our own motives. What Darwin was really saying there was it's all we think we're in charge, but we're not really. And there's some very good evidence to show, generated by a chap called Leichhardt, that we're not really in control. So what he did was he had participants look at a massive countdown clock, and he also gave them a little button to press, or it was actually like a lever to pull on. And he basically said, look, at some point in the next 30 seconds, I want you to let go of the lever. And then he basically recorded what was going on in their brains using EEG. He asked them at what point did they decide that they were going to let go of the lever. And what he actually showed was that the neural activity preceded the perception of a conscious decision, i.e., the decision was made by the brain, and then the idea that it was intentional, volitional, that you have agency came afterwards. So to be honest, I mean, we're all just maybe we're all just screwed, and our brains will get on with whatever they're getting on with.
Gumby's got a hand up.
Hi, yeah. So my name is Mutsa. That was really a fascinating presentation. And I guess my question is, do you think this can be used to treat conditions? So I just thought of the example you said of the guy who had his leg chopped off, and if it fires and sort of, looks at the next limb, then could you take that chip and give it to someone who's got, for example, erectile dysfunction, and then it sort of helps that person out? Do you think there could be that transfer of,
Yeah, so definitely. So one area would be in the control of prostheses. Okay, so if you've had your leg chopped off, you can have some really super, very expensive bionic limbs that are brilliant. That they're a feat of modern engineering and science. But what they rely on is each of the levers within the prosthetic limb makes the limb flex or extend, or your toe go this way or that way. Each of those is controlled by a little electrode, which is actually just records from the muscle in the remaining part of the tissue. Okay, so now instead of if you kind of stretch your quadriceps, now it might change your ankle instead. So then what the patient's brain is learning now is rewiring itself, right? Because signal out to go, okay, let's contract a quadriceps, and the robotic ankle moves. So the brain's got this feedback signal which says, oh, I've seen this ankle move now, and eventually it rewires. So it says, right, then it becomes unconscious. Okay, then we don't have to think, oh, I'll stretch my thigh and that'll change this. It becomes unconscious. Okay, all very well and good, but it's a really slow learning process. And the reason that it's so slow is because you've got to observe the effects of what you're doing really carefully. You've got to look at the ankle, right? Because you're not getting any feedback. There's no feedback to the brain, but there's no joint sensation. It's just seeing it move, right? Now, what we can do when we implant an electrode directly into the brain is we can give the feedback and read without all the messy neuronal circuitry and musculature coming in between. So we should be able to teach people, firstly, very much quicker as to how to use thought to control their prostheses. And secondly, we should be able to do it finer control. And so as our robotics get better, we it's not just can you use a robotic arm to hold a cup. Now it's can you use your robotic arm to play a great piece of music on the piano. And so that's one really exciting area. When it comes to erectile dysfunction, of course, yeah, we already have pumps and things like that, which are used surgically to treat erectile dysfunction. No reason why we can't be controlling those. We just have to find where in the brain is the arousal center. Probably a bit tougher than finding out where the bit that controls your ankle is, but yeah, I'm sure we will. Remember that the 21st century has been much touted as the century of the brain, and it's something I very much believe to be true. I think that this 1,400 grams of soft gelatinous grey tissue between our ears is the most astonishing, complicated, unlikely thing in the universe that we know of. It shouldn't exist. It defies all laws of entropy. That it has become generate the singularity of consciousness, but yeah, it seems to have done it. So I think I'm so excited about all the things we'll be able to do this century.
I think Hayley, you got your hand up?
On mute. That's classic 21st century mistake, that, isn't it? Interestingly, Phil has asked part of what I was going to ask. So I wondered what the similarities is with Parkinson's and the deep brain stimulation, but also how that could be expanded to sort of neurodivergent conditions, and whether in the future that will form part of a treatment pathway for somebody whose symptoms are unworkable.
Yes, as I say, I mean, we already are using deep brain stimulation that we first used for movement disorders in order to treat mood disorders. Now, the treatment of mood disorders per se poses some ethical challenges. Is that just who they are, or is that a pathology, or that sort of question like that? I think, though, that the most important thing here is just make sure that control, it always has to be within the control of the individual, and an individual making an informed consent about what they're doing, what the risks are, what the likely outcomes are. You know, always having the ability to make that choice of agency, and the ability to switch it off. You know, fundamentally, have it taken out or switch it off. Now, I actually believe that technologies like this, particularly the ones that I have in my hands, are hugely democratizing. Because everyone's like, oh my God, the corporation's now in your body. Well, it's not actually. That's absolutely not in my body, because I'm the one programming these chips. I'm deciding what's on them, which doors they open, which bits of my medical history are shared, whether I send you to my LinkedIn profile or send you off into the dark web to do something nefarious. But I think as long as we maintain that principle, we can sustain it is another question. So I think when I think about implants today, even implants that I worked on in hospitals, they're very much like the arena of the hobbyist right now. It's kind of like Jobs and Wozniak in a garage inventing the new Apple computer. It's a hobbyist activity, and we chat online about things most people would find tedious as anything. So that's okay. That's fine for the minute. And even with these deep brain stimulators, I mean, it was just us, and it was just my friends and I in our lab, messing about, and eventually putting it into patients, still messing about really, but with good intent. Now, is it going to become like in the workplace? We have got some ethical problems here and questions, and I'll leave to one side, treating neurodivergence and things like that. But I will point to another sort of ethical problem we've got, which is that in some companies, people are offered the opportunity to have free implants that they can use to log into work or log into certain work environments. And no one's ever been, like all things, there's a bit of pressure, right? There's peer pressure or employer pressure and all that sort of thing. That does give me a little bit of concern in that arena. But as we become more powerful in general at what we're able to do to modify the body and manipulate the brain, with power corrupts, and this really is absolute power. So I guess there's always a bit of a risk there that we'll see people having implants for, the treatment of homosexuality, the conformity to certain societal norms. And do we have the power to do that? Well, maybe not quite yet, but almost certainly very soon.
So I've got another question. I'm quite a big fan of sci-fi, and I think I saw a program a while ago called Years and Years, and they talk about transhumanism and the potential for us to at some point in the future download our consciousness into a machine and live forever. Is that something that is completely far-fetched in your opinion, or something we could potentially move towards?
Hey, so well, I'm 37 years old. So that means that in my lifetime, every single atom in my body has been replaced at least twice. So there is not one atom, one physical bit of me when I was 15 in my body right now. Okay, so that firstly shows you this principle, which is that our cells, our consciousness, if you will, is independent of perpetual physical bits of the universe. Okay, we start from that principle, and as soon as we understand and realize that, we've got to ask a question then about downloading our consciousness into a machine. We've got to say, is there something fundamentally different between brains, the way that they're organized, and the way that silicon works, the way the microprocessor works? Because maybe that, by the way, that might not be our only option, because we're almost certainly going to have biological computers in the future, carbon computers, but let's say we've got silicon at the minute. Can we actually, therefore, get the data out of our heads and replicate that and model it in a machine? Well, the first thing to be able to do is about recording, right? It's fundamentally recording what our brains are up to. Now, the thing is, what makes you is from the point of view of an outside observer, is how you consistently respond to environmental cues, right? So, for example, I know if I were to go and shout at my sister about like the fact her coffee machine's a mess, she would cry. And I know she would cry, and that's why I never shout at my sister about things like that anymore. But that's how I know her personality, right? So input, output defines her. Now there has to be a million output relationships before it's her, rather than just one of the 5% of people who will get really annoyed if you start criticizing their housework. So that's me as an outside observer. Now her, as the internal observer, okay, has a lot more going on, right? So it's not just Joe's annoyed with my coffee. Joe says it's moldy, my coffee machine, so I cry. There's lots of thinking going on, that very sense of consciousness, that, feeling of sadness, my brother shouldn't be criticizing, I know I was going to get round to it, oh my God, I'm a failure, all those sorts of things that actually are the bit in between. They're the ghost in the machine. Now, therefore, by the way, I'm just assuming that. It's called Levine's explanatory gap. It means I have absolutely no idea if my sister is conscious. I have no idea if anyone. It's completely impossible for me to know any of that. I think I know I'm conscious, but I have no idea if anybody else is. So if I were to download my sister by doing lots of recordings over the course of her life and working out input-output correlation, and then I was to pop her into a piece of silicon, and I would look at the silicon which controlled the robot, and let's say it's all humanoid and lifelike. And exactly what happened? I shout at the robot about the mold on the coffee machine, the robot cries. So I think I've done it. I think I've downloaded my sister. But I don't know. I could never know. But then I could never know right now, so I'm back where I started. But my suspicion is she's probably conscious. But my suspicion if I had a robot would be probably not. But yeah, this is a big philosophical question, obviously. But I'm sure I can make a robot cry, to be honest. But whether or not I can make it feel like my sister feels, but I'm certainly not smart enough.
Are there any more questions? No? That was absolutely fascinating. I think I could probably talk to you for like hours and hours and hours. But thank you so much for coming along and doing this for us. It was amazing.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And I hope you all have a good weekend.